Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to this event, which is the joint event hosted by both the Danube Institute and the university, and we're very delighted to see you all here. Now, I think the very first magazine I edited was in 1968, produced its first issue, and had an article entitled Varieties of Conservatism by an American scholar, Robert Lindsay Schutinger, who died last year. It was not my first intimation, but the beginning of realizing that conservatism is not always easy to define. At different times and different places, it means different things. The author of that article, Varieties of Conservatism, illustrated this with the example of the phrase conservative socialist. He says, what is a conservative socialist? Well, it could be the kind of socialist who has decided that he wants to move more towards the center, to be more moderate, maybe follow Bernstein rather than Marx, and therefore seems to most people to be a reasonably conservative, responsible kind of socialist. Or a conservative socialist could be the kind of socialist who is passionately addicted to the pure milk of Marxism, Leninism, and consequently is a conservative socialist in the sense that that is what he's conserving. Or, concluded the author, it might mean a socialist who dresses and acts in a conservative, moderate, and respectable manner. Well, of course, we are here to discuss a book on conservatism, the political philosophy of conservatism, I think in a much deeper way. The book, which we're introducing here, A Philosophy of Conservatism, Prudence, Moderation, and Tradition, appears at a time of great ferment among political philosophers, and particularly among conservatives, both political philosophers and statesmen on both sides of the Atlantic. This book is important, and it takes a fresh look at what conservatism is constituted by in our time, and not merely in our time, but throughout history, from the Greeks right to the present, from Aristotle to Oakeshott, so to speak. And it's a book which sees the political philosophy of conservatism as one that roots itself in the virtue of prudence rather than the virtue of justice, which more generally is the concern of much political philosophy. Now, I'm not going to summarize the book further, because we will hear in a moment from the book's distinguished author, Ferenc Hörcher, who is at this university and who has had an impressive career in academic life, but also is well known to conservative audiences and academic audiences abroad as well. He's one of the leading political philosophers in this country, but he has links, both personal and philosophical, with conservative thinkers abroad, most powerfully with Roger Scruton, who died recently, but whose preeminence in modern English conservative thought is now widely and increasingly realized. And Ferenc, I think it can be said, with this book, makes a bid to occupy the same position in this part of Europe. I'm going after Ferenc has spoken and given some remarks about his book. I will then invite our two distinguished guests to respond to him, and then we will have a discussion which will expand to include questions from the audience and indeed points from the audience. So right away, let me begin by asking Ferenc Hörcher to address us about his book.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a very difficult task as well for me to talk about a book which, as all books actually, has a long history. Books have their history, and even a book which has been published just recently. It came out of print this January. has a history. Because I'm an old man, and I was working on that for decades, actually. Since one of my students, who by now is a famous legal scholar, right now working in Austria, asked me at the Catholic University where I taught him legal theory. It was in the late 1990s, whether what you teach you will actually put down and publish. And well, I thought that's a nice idea. Indeed, that's the usual way that philosophers used to do it in the good old days. They taught the things from their books. So I thought it's a must. If your student, provokes it like that, you should do it. And that's one part of the story. So it starts at least from the second half of the 90s. But then I wonder if there is someone in this room who can recognize this knee. Because it's from a place which is really important for me. My tie comes from Oriel College, Oxford, from 88 when I stayed there as a, sorry to say, Soros scholar. And it was quite a remarkable year for me. And I met a professor in London in those days, Professor László Peter László professor. And I explained to him about my researches over there, and it was about what I call the third wave. So I was, fed up with communism. It was late 80s, and I was, a bit afraid of the Western world. So I thought that, well, third wave, that's the way to do it. And well, he said, well, it's a very nice idea to look at the third wave. Why don't you start it on the first one? Take one after the other. So start with the first one. And I thought that's again something that is quite remarkable. Maybe one should start from the beginning and try to work it through. So these are the two pillars for me that gave me the courage to do it. And then it was in 2005 that I spent a few years half a year in Holland, in Wassenaar. And then in 2009, half a year at Notre Dame University, South Bend in the US. Half a year. I wrote versions of the book and never published it. So it took some time to get it through. And then, time went by and politics developed. And I also met Roger Scruton. And with him, there is one fundamental thing that is crucial for me, besides being a British conservative. That he has got two interests, the arts and politics. And my personal story is the same. I started to study the philosophy of art and to teach it for decades at the Catholic University. But I was also interested in politics. When after the transition, the political field opened up, it was a great opportunity. I missed the opportunity to join the club of those who do it, the doers, as we learned it just a few weeks ago in Rome. So I became a thinker, not a doer. But still, the lines are parallel. You have to do something and the other one has to write about it, or someone does it and you think about it. So there was Roger, and I would like to to recall his memory in this occasion to commemorate the inspiration that came from him. But what is the book about? It has got two parts. The first part is a historical part. It is nothing more than the history of virtue, of the cardinal virtue of prudence, prudentia. It takes different authors historically, starting with Aristotle, going over Cicero, the church fathers, Augustine, Aquinas, and so on and so on. That's 100 pages or even less, but still something to get through. But why? Because I think that the major political philosophies of the 20th century, and more particularly the liberal branch of that, focused more on justice than on any of the other virtues. And they didn't even recognize that it was a virtue that they were dealing with. So I thought, well, surely they have got good reasons to do so. But justice is something that was never achieved in politics, unfortunately, by the way. However, there were a lot of prudent politicians, so why don't we start from what actually exists and try to see how it works out? So I pushed away justice, not to forget about it, but not to put it into the focus of my interest. I rather focused on the virtue of prudence, because I think that politics is about practical wisdom. Prudence means practical wisdom in everyday English. So it's the sort of knowledge that a politician needs in order to do it, to create something out of the blue, or rather out of what really exists over there. So that's the basic idea, to put prudence there. That was the first half of the book. The second half, and there I finish, the second half is about the relationship between the individual and the community. Why? Because I think that the politician alone is a lonely traveler, or would be a lonely traveler, and the distance is far away, and it's very hard to arrive at that distant target. Why? Because there are very strict, very severe constraints in politics, and I name only 3 in this book. The time constraint, that you have to find the right moment for the right action. Then there is agency constraint. You need to have the right person to do the sort of thing that needs to be done. And there is a third one, which for the moment I forgot, but let me check it. It's the knowledge constraint. The constraint that you will never know all the details that you would need to do it properly. So time constraint, agency constraint, and knowledge constraint. So the lonely traveler depends partly, by the way, on his own or her own experience, to the experience of the journey that he or she has already gone through. But there is this further dimension of politics, the others. No human virtue, no human wisdom can tell everything for the individual if it's only the individual's experience that is taken into account. So you need the community's wisdom or tradition. That's the second word in the subtitle, and there is the third one. When you have got the individual relying on his or her own character, virtue, experience, and you have got the community of which he belongs or she belongs to, and the wisdom, tradition of that particular community. There is a third need, that you should not overact the case. Most of the time we want to do more than what is proper, because we want to do it real. And that's sometimes a real problem. In the 20th century, we have got a lot of experiences of overdoing politics. So what is the third factor? You need moderation. Partly self-moderation, moderate yourself, and also to keep the political scene calm and stable. Order, you need order. So these are the ideas that I wanted to share with my readers and that I taught my students. And I'm happy that you are here, and I would like to hear your views of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferenc. We'll come back to you in a few minutes, but now may I introduce the first commentator, Richard Legaud. Richard Legaud is the member of the European Parliament, but he has had, as you can read in the paper we've distributed, two very successful careers, one as a political theorist, Professor of Philosophy at Jagiellonian University, and another as a politician, holding such offices as the Minister of Education in Poland, and as being the Deputy Chairman of the European Conservative and Reformers Group in Brussels at the European Parliament, where he still serves and where he is now and serves. Does that group still exist, doesn't it? But it's presumably will be changing shortly.
Should I answer this question?
Well, I think possibly when you've answered some of the others, but thank you. So let me just then welcome you and invite you to respond.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ferenc, and congratulations. This is a splendid book and a pleasure to read. I've known Ferenc for 30 years, which is where you were going from the airport downtown. We just try to remember the first time you met. It was a long time ago. And I always admire Ferenc's philosophical insights and his wide knowledge and erudition and analytical skill. And you have it in this book, which is a great read. It's well researched, it's clearly argued, it's arguably constructed. Since the work of Joseph Pieper on prudence, I have not read such an engaging book on this subject. You know more or less what the book is about. The author himself gave you and provided you with an outline. Some you might have read already, but just roughly speaking, if you can speak about politics of prudence would be a sort of middle way between political rationalism on the one hand and power politics on the other. Political rational in the sense that politics based on abstract principles of abstract rules of politics, or that has a rational blueprint that should somehow be implemented in reality, and power politics is the politics that takes into account only one factor, which is power. So this politics of prudence or conservative politics, if you will, is something in between, but it's not really a compromise. It's a quality in itself. It's not a bit of this and a bit of that. It's something that is very essentially distinct. Ferenc, if I understand him correctly, believes that politics is an art. Politics is not an algorithm. It's an art. And I cannot agree more with it, both as a a scholar and as a politician. But there is, of course, a trick in it. If it is an art, it cannot be accurately described. Just you cannot accurately describe the art of painting or piano playing. One cannot give an abstract account of what makes a musical virtuoso. So whoever puts himself in the position of a theorist of politics, the politics which rests and the politics which is the politics of prudence, finds himself in a difficult situation because he wants to describe something which really cannot be described. But we can have some insights into it, and we have really we have these insights in this book. I'm just there has been several comments have been made about conservatism, both by John and by Ferenc. I'm just wondering if this politics of prudence, which is described here, philosophy of prudence, but also politics of prudence, is it only conservative politics, or is it politics as such? It means that non-prudential politics would be, according to the author, an inferior type of politics. I mean, if you are a liberal politician, a sort of Rawlsian type of politician, or a Hayekian type of politician, that you have either a set of abstract principles, social democratic, right, in the case of John Rawls, or you have free marketeer, and you want to build a free market system in your country, and you used political means to achieve that. I mean, is it really an inferior type of politics? And I would tend to agree with that conclusion. I'm not sure if Ferenc would agree with it. But anyhow, the way I read this book is that it is only this type of politics that can deal with what Ferenc calls constraints and can make good use of what he calls resources. That is, make good use of human characters and of moral, social, and political tradition. But a lot of the book, I mean, the substantial part of the book is about theory, right? It's about philosophy. It talks about virtues. By the way, justice, which for the ancients, justice was clearly a virtue. I'm not one of the cardinal virtues. I'm not sure if currently justice is considered a virtue. Prudence is defined as a virtue, but I can think of very few philosophers who would continue the Socratic tradition or the Platonic tradition, for whom justice was primarily a virtue. Yes, it could be a set of principles according to which you organize a society, but primarily it was a virtue, a personal quality that you had. Socrates considered himself a just man. But that's a minor point. What is important is that the only example from political practice that you get in this book is, which is illustration of this type of politics, is early modern Dutch urban republicanism. I'm just wondering why this, it's not that I disagree. I think it's a good example to the extent that I am knowledgeable enough about early modern Dutch urban republicanism. But I wonder if the author could give us some more examples, probably modern ones. I wonder to what extent current Hungarian politics is illustrative of politics of prudence. Like how it can be this concept of prudential politics, or politics based on prudence, can be applied to modern politics. The modern society, which is atomized, global, highly politicized, ideologized, which is flat rather than based on a hierarchy, and has definitely weakened communities. In the Netherlands, and that's the description which we have from the book, in those Dutch communities there was, as Ferenc quotes one of the historians, a strict legal regime. Now, the question is, if you do not have a strict legal regime, can you really think of political conservatism or conservative politics as something viable? Also, he quotes, Ferenc quotes Johan Huizinga's view that the Dutch success did not stem from modernization, that it's rejecting the old and embracing the new. There was no this view that in order for you to be successful, you have to modernize the society, reject what is the anachronistic, and adopt what's new and modern and more efficient. This is one of the most persistent stereotypes in today's world, I think, in modernity probably, which is based, of course, on our experience of technology. That's what is characteristic of technology, is that newer things are better, usually, are better than older things. We like to have newer computers, newer cars, right? And we somehow believe that in society we also have to have something newer. We speak of the traditional solution. Well, we reject traditional solution. We reject traditional family, because traditional family or traditional solution is like an old radio that doesn't work, right? Or black and white television set. So I'm just wondering what use can you make of these concept and these, shall I say, theoretical conclusions from the Dutch experience. What conclusions can you draw for today's work, for today's politician, Hungarian or Polish? There are also two concepts which I think do not appear in the book. Not that they are needed. They are probably not needed for the argument that is being put forward. But it also raises the concept of the possibility of conservative politics today. The first concept is democracy. Democracy, which is based, at least democracy as we know it, is based on the internal divisions. The democracy is always divided. There are at least two sides, right? Two parties, sometimes more parties, and sometimes the divisions are deep. So democracy, I would say, favors excess rather than moderation. In democracy, you have to identify yourself in stronger terms to make yourself different from your rivals, from the opposition, if you are in the government, or from the government, if you are in the opposition. So I think the democracy, so radicalism would be rather the natural outcome of democratic politics rather than moderation. So I would think, I'm not quite sure, perhaps I will learn something from Ferenc, that democracy is a system that tends to subvert a lot of what the Dutch had taken for granted long time ago. And the second concept, which is not there and also is extremely important for understanding today's politics, is ideology. Ideology meaning we want to have a simple message that covers everything. If you want to make a political choice, you want to vote in favor or against, you want to negotiate, you want to have a clear message. So everything is, or a lot is being ideologized or reduced to few simple notions or slogans. You do not bother with details, with subtleties, and ideology covers everything, right? And there are no things that you accept or take for granted. The ideology is all-encompassing notion. So if ideology is so important today, it means that it favors political rationalism, or what Oakeshott called political rationalism, or political blueprints. And it ignores the constraints about which Ferenc wrote in his book, and it squanders the resources, or ignores the resources. And just to finish what I'm going to say now, a sentence or two from the perspective of someone who has been an active politician for the last 15 years. If you ask me what intellectual key we should use to understand politics, I would say that the notion number one in politics is power. Power is the engine. Power in a large sense, not in a very simplistic. There are all sorts of power. So deliberation is secondary. Power is most important. Power is the money you use in politics. If you negotiate, you want something, and you, in order to achieve something, you give something to somebody else. And this something is power. It's like money. As I say, in a very large sense, not a very simplistic. So I would, from my experience, I would say that politics resembles the Machiavellian view, which Ferenc very aptly describes following Pocock's book, and where you have two notions, the notions of virtu, which is not, of course, Socratic or Christian virtue, but is skillful determination to achieve an end, and prudence in a reduced sense. Ferenc uses two words which I think are very accurate: audacity and caution. So I would say politics is more about audacity and caution than about prudence. or virtues. So you are, yes, you want to achieve as much as you can, or as you want, but you are cautious. And I know it's a notion which falls far below the prudence which you describe in your book, which is the noble kind of prudence. But I'm afraid that in real politics, the prudence, if it has survived still, not as a regulative idea, not as a part of moral education, which of course is very important, but as something that is very close to political experience, prudence is mostly caution.
May I introduce Robert Grant, a distinguished British academic who has held the Emeritus Professor of Modern Thought at the University of Glasgow, but along with many other accolades and awards, I think he is proudest of having been declared an undesirable person by the Czechoslovak Security Service in 1986. For his work in spreading, in extending in lectures in modern philosophy, literature, and so on, under the communists in secret, along with one or two other people, with Roger Scruton. So, Robert, may I introduce you?
Thank you, John. Thank you. The author and Richard have both admirably summed up what the book is about. I'd just like to pick up a few scraps that have occurred to me while I was reading it, rather than summarize it again. Let me begin with picking up Richard's very last point. I had actually written it on this sheet before he even got to it. The identification of prudence with caution. That seems to me an important thing. And the classical notion of prudentia, which is really what Ferenc's book is about, prudentia doesn't quite answer, I think, to what we in English mean nowadays by prudence. It is actually, as Ferenc says several times, it's more like what we call statesmanship. It's not like politicking. It's more impartial than that. And also, a rather exotic point, it does seem, as Ferenc also points out, to be more of a skill than a simple virtue. It may be a virtue, but it's not a simple virtue. And the reason for that, I think, is because in politics, you're not dealing with face-to-face relationships between individuals. It's much easier to be virtuous face-to-face because you've only got one person to consider, and that is the person you're dealing with. In politics, however virtuous you are, however well-meaning you are, whatever you do, if you enact certain provisions which are going to make a society go this way rather than that, there is somebody whose nose you're going to put out of joint, and there is somebody who is going to hate you and think you are wicked. In other words, virtue in politics is not a simple thing at all. Some people, I think, for example, Machiavelli, would be perfectly happy to get rid of that notion altogether. Machiavelli is, after all, is about how to get and to hang on to power. It's not about how to be good. He does think, people have been unfair to Machiavelli, calling him Old Nick, like the devil and so on. And of course the Elizabethans went completely crackers with the wickedness of the Machiavel and all this kind of thing. But in fact, what Machiavelli is simply, as Ferenc points out, is really just a realist. If you want to get power, it might even be necessary for you to get power, then there are certain things, certain scruples you have to put on one side. And this is more obvious, I think, in the case where the ruler is a monarch or a small number of people, perhaps, or one person, than when it's, say, a democracy. Queen Elizabeth I said, I'm talking about individual rulers here, somebody said, you must do this, madam, blah, 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 or your majesty, to which she replied, young man, must is not a word to be used to princes, in other words, to a monarch. And the reason is because the kind of decisions that a monarch is called upon to make, since these affect a vast variety of people, all of whom have different propensities and wishes and so on, you can never satisfy everybody. And that is why a certain brand of old-fashioned conservatism believes, like the third Lord Salisbury, in doing as little as possible. He was once upbraided by some impertinent journalist and said, Prime Minister, have you actually done anything about this at all, some supposedly burning issue? To which Salisbury replied proudly, not a thing. Because Salisbury quite rightly saw that, what is a burning issue today will soon be overtaken by another one, and everybody will forget about the first one. Otherwise known in English as kicking the can down the road. He also came up with this splendid maxim, Salisbury did, delay is life. Hold it up. So I don't think there is a problem of ethics in politics. As I've said, the human object, the ruled party, is collective, and whoever does the ruling, it's unlikely to be as many people as those who are ruled, except in some kinds of perhaps extreme democracies. And are they capable of, is an extreme democracy capable of prudence? I think it is, but only if, again, as Ferenc points out, if there is a culture, a political culture, under which, as has recently been used over the Brexit business in Britain, as long as the losers consent, which of course to a large extent they haven't. But that's a Rousseauvian notion, isn't it? That the losers must consent if it's to be a real democracy. In other words, there is something they have to rate higher than their immediate political wishes. And the thing that they rate higher than their immediate political wishes is social harmony. They're prepared to let the others get away with it rather than make a fuss. And of course, the others, knowing that they're counting on the tolerance of the other faction, are likely to be less demanding about what they want. That's assuming, of course, that politics is about getting what you want. Richard said that politics, to some extent, is about achieving what you can, but is it always? It might be about achieving what they, the ruled, would like. Perhaps we shouldn't think about politics as putting into effect what we want. We should ask what they want. In fact, here, it does coincide very much, as it doesn't normally, with face-to-face relationships with a single other person. We get on with each other by putting the other person's wishes first, or at least pretending to do so, to keep them on side. An interesting question that Ferenc raises again and again, or mentions anyway, is the problem, in Sartre's phrase, of dirty hands. Whatever you do in politics, somebody is going to, as I've said, somebody's going to be put out by it, and you may have to do terrible things that you would not dream of doing in a private relationship. As I've said, the individual ruler can hardly avoid them. Must is not a word to be used to princes. And democratic rulers, is it any different, or do we all get dirty hands? I'm thinking of a particular and very unpleasant event in Thucydides, which I don't think anybody has mentioned, which is the the way the Athenians treated the Melians. And they said, you know, if you don't surrender and let us use your island as a base for the war against Sparta, we're simply going to kill you all. And the Melians went away and thought about this, and they said, go ahead. And the Athenians did. That was a collective decision. And it seems very, very shocking to us. In fact, it is very shocking. One thing one can say about dirty hands generally, if dirty hands are inevitable, and I think they always are, there's always something grubby about politics, which is why genuinely virtuous people don't like it very much, or people of any taste. If they're inevitable, then straightforwardly virtuous politics are impossible. Simply because you can't do right by everybody. You can do only as much as you can. So the best in politics is only, as Oakeshott said, the best in the circumstances. Might and right, this is part of it, I think. Machiavelli is usually accused of saying that might is the important thing and you can forget about right. He doesn't quite say that. He says it's better to be good than bad, but it's better to be bad than to lose. Because if you lose, then somebody worse than you is likely to take over. You need to be like the little Dutch boy who put his finger in the hole in the dike. But might can dispense with right, but right, in order to be effectual, needs might either to enforce it or to protect it. So you can't do without power. But as Richard said, you know, power. He's talking about politics, but power politics strictly, if taken literally, is not really politics at all. Because politics usually, and I mean authentically, I think, involves negotiation. Power politics simply says, as the Athenians did to the Melians, you obey or we kill you. That's not politics. That's Stalin. You know. Prudence is a curious word. We don't always associate it with virtue. Sometimes we think of it as being as having connotations of cunning and calculation. Coleridge, referring to that speech in Shakespeare's Macbeth, where Macbeth enumerates all the reasons not to kill Duncan. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, that's a strong both against the deed and so on. In the end, he's argued himself into not doing it, and it's only because Lady Macbeth comes along and says, what kind of man are you, that he does it. But Coleridge said, that particular speech of Macbeth's ends with a horrific vision of pity like a naked newborn babe striding the glass. You know, the uproar will be huge if the king is murdered. And it looks as if he's putting this forward as a prudential consideration against it, but actually not. He's horrified at the thought of what he's said, promised his wife that he's going to do. And this, Coleridge says, is mistaking conscience for prudence. So prudence here definitely, it doesn't mean caution. It means calculation, cunning, and so on. I shouldn't kill the king because, A, you shouldn't go around killing kings, and then I am his cousin, and so and so and so and so. And then it will turn the state of Scotland into an uproar. But what he's not arguing from a prudential point of view at all. What really motivates him to give up the thought of murder is that it's a horrific thing to do. And, you know, he may be an extremely brave and tough soldier, but it's not in his nature to go around killing his king and his cousin, particularly if he's also his guest. So I think prudence in this sense, the sense that Coleridge is using it, is something at best neutral and at worst amoral. Why is wisdom? Certainly wisdom is part of prudence. why do we associate wisdom with goodness? We don't think of a wicked person, however intelligent he is, and however much he understands how to exploit people. He can see into their minds. He's completely, he's completely empathetic. But we don't think of wise people as being evil or bad. We think of them as being cunning. Iago would be a very good example. He's intelligent but not wise. He's wise enough to see how to wind up Othello. But this is not for him a virtue. Deceit, to deceive people, requires genuine human insight to do it properly. Think of all those famous con men in history. It requires insight. So does wise rule. And a paradox here, of course, is that even the wise ruler may need occasionally to employ deceit. This was Plato's point, wasn't it, about the noble lie. A well-meaning lie, it'll keep them quiet. And this may be necessary. So I think what I would like to say is that there is a problem in all politics, which is why many decent people do not care for politics at all and stay as far away from it as possible. And that is, it is not easily combined with unambiguous, undiluted goodness. You can't do it. And this is why Oakeshott, amongst others, regards it as, very much a sort of second-rate accomplishment. He admires people who can keep the show on the road, but he does also say, that, as Matthew Arnold did, that politics requires a certain coarseness of moral fibre and a certain bluntness of perception. If you're too scrupulous, you can't do it. On the other hand, it's got to be done. So I think perhaps whatever view of politics we take, we're forced in a way to admit that it's both necessary and in some ways not a very admirable thing. I would like to get out of that problem, but I can't. So, what else is there to say? Power, rules. As I've said, I think perhaps the most important thing I would like to say here is that democracy maybe is not necessarily as conflict-ridden as we sometimes make it. It is not, so long as there is an existing political culture of accommodation and tolerance. But, as Ferenc rightly points out, that is something which actually precedes politics. You cannot simply lift a model of politics from one culture and transfer it to another and hope that it will wash. It won't. Just look what American liberalism has done when imposed on Iraq. It made it even worse than it was under Saddam. So all this rather argues against Oakeshott's notion of the value of what he calls civil association. If civil association is possible at all, it's because there is a predisposition towards it in the culture both of the rulers and of the ruled in any society. And the idea that it can somehow generate tolerance and moderation and all those things by itself, I think is a mistake. It's an effect rather than a cause, civil association. Anyway, I think that's all I want to say for the moment. I'm sorry, that's rather scrappy, but anyway, I will retire gracefully.
Well, I didn't think, is this working? Yes, I didn't think it was scrappy at all. I think it was a very interesting ramble around some good thoughts. But with great views along the way. I would now, I think we've had three extremely interesting and important contributions. I now propose to ask each of the speakers one question and maybe a follow-up if they say something which I think requires further explanation, and then I'll throw the meeting open to the floor. The first question I will ask is a very straightforward one to you, Ferenc. Obviously, prudence in politics differs somewhat from prudence in everyday life, but if it's a founding virtue of conservatism, what are the relationships of other political philosophies to prudence? What is the relationship of socialism or of liberalism to the virtue of prudence?
Does it work? Short answer, I don't know. It's not my job. Someone else can answer it. We can ask some socialist politicians or thinkers, whoever. So I'm really not.
Well, let me give you an example then. How do you judge? This is an example from British politics and Russian politics. An Australian diplomat trying to understand British politics once made a comparison. He said that Tony Blair's politics, Blairism, was a development of Gorbachevism, which he defined as a politics that substituted daring for thought and consisted of a series of leaps into the unknown. Now that's a kind of politics, isn't it? It's obviously not a prudent politics. Where would you put those two figures in relation to a politics of prudence, Gorbachev and Blair?
Well, I would say that neither of them were conservatives, so they are not, my stock. But let me address something that is connected to this problem and which was mentioned earlier. Present-day examples, because I think that the way Bob presented his case was to give certain examples, historical, and show how they actually worked in those contexts. And my example, what do you think? Who could be the right example for me in this room today? Yes, it's Victor, of course. So let me address the problem of Orbán Viktor in the context of my book. His name is not mentioned in it, so it's something that is, extra to it. But I think that the issue is something that needs to be confronted. Why? Because I think that I think he is a prudential politician, a tremendously, fascinatingly, surprisingly talented, prudent politician, and a successful one as well, at least so far. We don't know about the future. Let's be cautious. He is fascinatingly successful because he is clever, I guess. But that's not enough, I guess. Because, he is in politics for 30 years. And 30 years really, it's too long for a politician. You cannot survive 30 years, and still on top, remain still on top. And that's what he does. So what's there? And my hunch is that, there is this prudential stuff. He knows the art of doing it, the art of politics, the art of power politics as well. I don't write anything about power, and Richard was quite correct to point it out. It's missing from there. But it's not missing from Orbán's politics, I think. But that's not enough, I would say. There is a further dimension, and that's something partly political, but partly extra-political. And I would say there is this moral dimension. And he still has a moral, he is morally on top in a certain sense of the word. In which sense? We are living here in a post-communist world, after 30 years still in a post-communist context, but also in a Europe which is in total chaos and crisis, and the culture war is all over the Western world, if I can use that phrase in this company. So, what is this moral extra of Orban? I think that what he does is actually to present a small, medium-sized community which has got a history that you see on the walls of this room, and which still survives. And he has to, embody that spirit. That's his agenda, and he, in a way, can do it. And he has got for that a majority decade after decade. I don't like a lot of what he's doing. I cannot stand it quite often. But the interesting thing is that I'm still, feeling that moral superiority. That's the interesting thing. And as a philosopher, I'm sure that it's a kind of this book is presenting politics much nicer than it really is. And I think that Richard pointed it out quite correctly, and then Bob just destroyed the whole thing. But I did it for some reason, and that's because I'm a philosopher. I'm not a politician, so I don't, and I'm not an advisor either. So I don't, and neither am I a political scientist. So I'm not interested in what really politics is about. I'm interested in what it ought to be about, what is there from the point of view of a philosopher. And I think it's simply important to confront our politicians with these ideas. They have to be powerful. They have to survive. They have to be elected, time after time. But they still have to stand up for certain standards. There is this demand that a philosopher can formulate, and I try to formulate that demand in this book.
Thank you very much. Richard, can I turn to you? There are 3 words, actually, in the subtitle of the book, which are the basis of politics of conservatism, and they are prudence, moderation, and tradition. Now, do you think that a conservative politics can restore any of these 3 different virtues, really, to a country in a post-revolutionary situation, which, after all, you have lived through? And can they be restored by a conservative politics? And if they can't, what is the conservative response to be?
I think it can. I can. The only example I can give, of course, is the example of my country. But generally, I would say that tradition is something that is there, right? It may be active, it may be latent, and at a certain moment being stimulated, or for whatever reason, it begins to energize people. The problem is that there are good traditions and there are bad traditions. And I was some years ago, I thought that communism was the system that resulted in the breakup, the deep rupture that the tradition was killed, that we kind of start from scratch, and whatever tradition there is, it's tradition that is limited to individuals, small groups, but it doesn't have the power to animate large movements, the society as such, and acquire some organized political shape. Now, I changed my mind as a result of the experience that we have. The problem is, however, that well, the Polish experience is how to preserve sovereignty and how to lose sovereignty. And we were managed to reawaken this pro-sovereignty tradition. But at the same time, the other tradition was reawakened too. So what we have now in my country is a very profound conflict between those who want to make Poland sovereign again, sovereign to the extent it's possible in the modern world, not sovereign in the sense of North Korea. But I don't know if this or there's some other reasons, but what it provoked the other tradition too, namely, no, we have to get rid of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a stupid concept, as one of my colleagues from the European Parliament said, a Polish colleague. She said, well, I hate this concept, it's so stupid. Of course, this was a ridiculous remark, but it's not only a question of language, also a question of actions and ideas. Yes, traditions are very much alive, but you do not know, you're never sure what's in this cauldron, right? And whatever may pop up.
Before I move on to Bob, let me just ask a question about a prominent Polish modern politician, namely Jaruzelski. Is there any sense in which his politics could be described as prudent, and is there therefore any sense in which they could be described as conservative?
No, although there were attempts to present him in such a way. A guy who imposes martial law on the society, not because he's forced by the Soviets, but because he's afraid of losing his power and is responsible for the destruction of the solidarity movement. No, I mean, if you speak of virtues, political virtues, they should, if they are virtues at all, they must lead to something. They must be beneficial to people or to society. They must be successful. And Jaruzelski was not a successful politician. He wasn't a successful politician because what he managed, the only success that he had, he saved his skin, and he saved the skin of his comrades. And of course, you may say that he didn't try to make another crackdown on the society and use the army against his own people for the second time, but that's hardly a virtue of prudence. So I don't think he was a man of prudence. I don't think Gorbachev was a man of prudence for a similar reason, that he wasn't successful. He just managed to let the system go to pieces, which is good. I mean, we perhaps might think of him warmly for that reason, but that's not enough to be a prudential politician, a man of prudence. I think the same goes for Tony Blair. I do not know much about Tony Blair. I never liked him particularly. I don't think he was terribly successful. His Britain was not a Britain of success, although perhaps he himself was a success. Personally, he was a successful politician, the prime minister. But was Britain better off under his leadership? I'm not quite sure. You're more knowledgeable than I am.
Well, I think he was very successful at winning elections, and Robert might differ with this, but I would say myself that he achieved a great deal of what he set out to achieve, but as time has passed, some of those achievements look very fragile and achievements which a lot of us wouldn't want to have had in the first place, but over to you.
Well, I think, was it Ferenc was saying earlier, how Blair dabbled in this and that, and often made fairly radical gestures without bothering to find out or consider how they would play in the end. I mean, a very good example is what he did with Scotland. He thought, I think, that Scottish devolution would shut the nationalists up, but in fact it's only made them more strident. With the ban on fox hunting, of course he got it completely wrong, and also he himself didn't agree with it. He thought it would make more trouble than it was worth, and he was not particularly interested in the welfare of foxes or the comfort of foxes, but he did it because somebody said at the time it was a chunk of red meat thrown to the left. And it was only red meat thrown to the left because the left believed that hunting was only for toffs and snooty types, not local farmers, farm labourers and the rest, though in fact it was. I don't know. I was very glad when Brown took over from Blair. I just didn't realise how short-lived my delight would be until we were all fed up with Brown too. No, Blair, there is I know one thing to be said in Blair's favour. He was a neighbour of my brother-in-law at the time in Islington. And my brother-in-law was an extremely eccentric Tory. But he approved of Blair because he said, if you parked across his drive, he wouldn't sue you, even though he's a lawyer. And he also said, your wife and children would be safe with him, which I'm not entirely sure applies to my brother-in-law. But he did find something good to say for Blair. But I got pretty fed up with him. That damn schoolboy grin.
Well, let me actually then move over to you again, Robert, to this question, probably a naive one, but what is the relationship, in a sense, of philosophical conservatism, as we're discussing it, to the actual performance of conservative governments in Britain? I particularly address your attention to Margaret Thatcher, because I know that you, along with Roger and other people, would be quite critical of her from a conservative standpoint, while also acknowledging that she was, of course, in some sense, a prudent politician.
Yes, well, she won 3 elections as well, didn't she?
Yes, she did. Actually, 4 if you count Major, who just got it.
I suppose so, yes. Yes, which was a great surprise.
Yes.
Yes, Mrs. Thatcher. Well, obviously, she did some very good things for Britain. They were Hayekian things, but so what? They worked. And I will say this for Mrs. Thatcher. Though one got a bit fed up with her stridency and all that kind of thing, she did, unlike any socialist politician we'd ever had, she finally got the working class off their knees and got them to shed their client status. And of course, this is one reason, I think, why she was resented by an awful lot of old-fashioned conservatives, because they didn't like to think of the working class being empowered. And also, it didn't go down very well with Labour politicians, because they, being mostly middle class and bossy, wanted the workers kept in their place, which of course you can do by handouts and all this kind of thing. And they still haven't given it up. If you look at all the contenders at present for the leadership of the Labour Party, they all belong, basically. Even Rebecca Long-Bailey, who regards herself as Corbyn's heir, all of them are still de haut en bas. And here is Boris Johnson, of course, boasting that he's the new champion of the working class, which to a certain extent, just look at the votes, he is.
Let me now, because I've been throwing out names of politicians and statesmen here, asking you to associate them with conservatism or not. And I want to take another case. This will be my last one before we throw it open to the floor, and it's addressed to all of you. This case is taken from today's newspapers, and it concerns F.W. Clarke, the last white South African president. I actually met de Klerk when I was a young journalist in the 70s, when he was the white hope of the stern, unbending Afrikaners. Subsequently, he navigated a skillful course through all of the perils of South African politics to actually achieve the end of apartheid and the installment of a non-racial democracy with a black majority. Within a relatively short time and without any of the bloodshed that a lot of people had been confidently predicting for the previous 30 years. So that looks like a very prudent course. On the other hand, a couple of days ago, when a parliamentary motion in South Africa wanted to declare that apartheid had been a crime against humanity and an evil on the scale of the Nazi Holocaust, he issued a statement saying it was very bad, but it wasn't as bad as that. Now, he has since been, and this is very familiar in modern politics, he has since been more or less forced to issue an apology for saying these things. So when we look at his career, which is a remarkable career, and we might say a successful one until now, what are we to, we might say that, we might not, but how are we to judge his career as an example of, so to speak, prudence in politics at this point, looking backward as well as forward? Well, I think probably the first person to reply should be Ferenc.
Well, I'm an extremely cautious person, so I would say that I don't judge him. I cannot judge him, and I wouldn't judge him. Why? Because I don't know the details. There is this knowledge constraint. I don't know, the temporal dimensions either, and there is no, it's not my community actually. The insider's view is always different from the outsider's view. So I can only say, common sense wisdoms or just commonplaces. I would be ashamed to do so. So let me just say that although the Dutch I like so much, there are some aspects of Dutch history which I haven't touched and which was not perhaps so very nice on a global scale. But again, I have to say it very cautiously. But I think that it's important that we as Europeans might have some common conscience as well. This might be something that is relevant. So after the Second World War, there was a real thinking of the basics of what Europeanness means. But that was not the case after 1990. And I still miss it a lot. I think that there was no, clear sheet after 1990 to see what has happened and what are the basics of our common policies. And I think that the present crisis is actually a cleavage in Europe that is widening, and that's the reason behind it. And that's very unprudent. So Brussels, for me, if you ask something out of my stock, who is not prudent. I think Brussels in that respect is very much non-prudent.
Yes. Richard?
Well, I don't think what options were open to him. I mean, he was clearly a very clever politician, and he did everything he could, but not all factors could have been taken into account, and perhaps some things could have been predicted, some perhaps not. I'm not sure. I remember somehow sidestepping, but a similar example, Rhodesia, right? And I remember very well, I was following very closely the developments in Rhodesia from the perspective of a citizen of a communist country. And of course you might guess who I supported at that time. But my impression was that there was an enormous pressure exerted also from Western governments to accept the National Front. They were called National Front, right? No, Patriotic Front. Patriotic Front. Yeah, Mugabe and Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, and especially Mugabe, who was a Marxist. Marxist was educated, and everybody knew he was a Marxist. But for some reason, he was regarded to be a more decent man than Bishop Muzorewa, who was a middle-of-the-road person. He probably deserved a larger support from Western governments. Again, I can say, I don't know what options could have been taken, but in case of Rhodesia, at least, my feeling is that the external actors didn't behave prudently enough, or perhaps their historical situation, their countries, their nations that find themselves in such predicament that nothing can be done. Maybe it was one of those examples that nothing could have been done.
Do you have any things to add, Robert?
I'd just like to go back to Richard's colleague. I've thought of a good way to come back on her when she says she finds sovereignty stupid, such a stupid idea. What does she think the EU Commission is? If you give up sovereignty here on this local level, you simply bestow it somewhere else. So, you know, the EU itself is as sovereign as anyone could possibly want, if they wanted it. Now, you can't get rid of it simply by abolishing it at the national level. It then comes in at the imperial level. So it seems to me, anyway.
Yes.
We disagree on that. I mean, I'm not supporting that point of view. I think I was trying to illustrate a certain way of thinking, which is quite powerful and influential in my country. I think it's nonsense. I think it's suicidal. Anybody with a minimum of intelligence could see how the EU works and what are the dangers of giving all part of the EU. But there are also people who found a new object of love and patriotism. When she was elected to the European Parliament, her first tweet was, "I am in paradise." Well, if you make a list of words to describe the European Parliament, paradise would be one of the last items.
I think there are some souls who'd be perfectly happy in that kind of paradise. Unfortunately, very large numbers of them go into politics too. But right now, I've now opened the questions to the floor. Would anyone like to ask the first question? And who has got the microphone to hand it round? Would you raise your hand to ask a question? Yes, the gentleman here.
Yes, I was just curious if you think that the virtues you've identified in conservatism in your book, which I haven't had the opportunity to read yet, unfortunately, are the same for continental Europe as for the Anglo-American world. Because, of course, traditionally, it's two very different traditions, I would say. I mean, there's a lot you could say, but I would say the most fundamental difference is that Anglo-American conservatism has always been focused more on the individual, whereas continental conservatism, at least historically, tends to be focused more on the community. So do you think these virtues hold true for both, or perhaps they do, but they're realized differently, depending on, I'd be curious to know
obviously
your
for you,
thoughts on
Ferenc.
that.
Yes, I think it's a very important question, and particularly for conservatism, because there is this distinction between, when we teach conservatism, we always make this as one of the first distinctions between British type or Anglo-American and continental conservatism. The case, however, is, so generally speaking, there are differences, so one should be cautious. But speaking here in Budapest and in this room, particularly again, where you see the history of this country, the interesting thing is that there were a number of aspects from which the Hungarian story and the British story had overlaps. At least that was the ideology of some of Hungarian thinkers, philosophers, as well as politicians, i.e. that the Hungarian unwritten constitution, the so-called historical constitution of Hungary, which was valid until 1949, so just a few decades ago it went over, was in many respects quite similar to the British unwritten constitution. So, and that's I think, quite a relevant thing, even if there is nothing in it. I mean, historically, the two things are surely rather different. And basically, Hungary belonged for centuries to the German tradition and based on the Roman law tradition, which was not the case with Britain, at least not in England. But still, the fact that customs and the customary ways of ruling the country was in many respects similar, at least ideologically, that was the claim. And I think this, if there is an ideology like that, then there must be something that one should look into. And that's my only hope, because I'm, in favor of British type conservatism.
Any other points from here, from the platform? No. In that case, next question, please. Yes, sorry. After Melissa. No, go on.
As I'm listening to the conversation, I keep thinking that does this not argue for the area of life which is governed politically to be kept as small as possible and to devolve power out to either individuals or to private institutions, so we keep the grubby, dirty hands off of it?
That's I think it's a very important issue, at least for me. The decentralization as a conservative agenda. I think that this is underestimated until now, and I think it's a crucial issue actually, and crucial for me as well, particularly or personally, because I'm right now I'm in a project of writing what I call the history of the European city. And my claim is that European cities were individual units, political units, not sovereign, not necessarily sovereign, but individual autonomous units, political units, which had their own history, which had their own constitutions sometimes, and which were quite important players in politics for centuries, up until 1800 or so. So I think that we underestimate the role of local politics, and in fact, philosophy, theory, does not address the issue, because political philosophers like to read about huge things like states or empires, and they don't care about the small ones, the small units. And I think they are really relevant, and it's the conservative agenda.
Any remarks? Yes.
Well, Britain was very much like that in the Middle Ages. I mean, there was the Prince Bishop of Durham, who had his own army and all this kind of thing, and all the big cities had royal charters which gave them very extensive powers, and I think those powers have shrunk as we've become more centralized. Of course, I mean, localism isn't everything. I mean, it could lead to very narrow minds. But it depends whose mind and who's got the power.
Well, again, I'm speaking here as a Pole. The Polish tradition was that of a decentralization, which cost us the loss of independent sovereignty for more than a century. I'm not particularly attached to this idea. I know that Jean-Jacques Rousseau loved it, and there are a lot of people who loved it, this decentralized Poland, but politically it was a disaster. And similar ideas came up after the demise of the communist system, when again such notions of civil society became very fashionable, and everyone was talking about necessity to create civil society, which is fine, except that the civil society is not substitute for well-functioning government, a state institution, and this is extremely important. That's why for at least 15 years, the institution of the Polish state were not independent. They were not independent internally, because they were influenced by various interest groups, and other institutions were powerless to stop this. So one does not exclude the other. I mean, of course, the cities have the tradition, the regions, and I agree with Melissa that yes, generally conservatives tend to favor the little platoons, right? But there are situations, there are regions, there are types of there are histories where it is the conservatives that have to take care of the state. Because if the state institutions do not work properly, then other institutions cannot.
But isn't then that the basic difference between the British tradition of conservatism and the continental one? Strong state, a strong nation, and power for the conservative agenda is at least one trend of the European conservative tradition. While the British one somehow tries to take care of these smaller units, and perhaps it's easier if your country was not dissolved for centuries.
I will not risk to answer this question having to distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Well, I'm going to say something which Robert can, so to speak, disagree with, possibly. I would say two responses. One is, yes, we want to have institutions, social and local, which grow naturally and organically in the society. There is something different, however, about the decentralization that's been attempted in devolution, the creation of a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Assembly and that kind of thing. And that's because one of the unifying factors in the United Kingdom was the Commons, was the Houses of Parliament. And it's quite hard to overstate the degree to which, in the 40s, 50s, and I think earlier, and 60s, the House of Commons as the arena in which politics was debated was an extraordinarily important element in unifying the country. I may be biased here because my job for 8 years was to actually report on what Parliament was doing. But there's no doubt that moments of high drama there were moments of high drama in the society. And now that's been devalued in a way, partly by, I would say, Tony Blair, who didn't like the Commons and had tried to take most of the drama of politics out of it and into the media. I mean, this was quite a deliberate strategy. It's one I think that had effects, not good ones. And secondly, the existence of a Scottish Parliament means an awful lot of politics now takes place in Scotland, for example, and is then translated into an antagonistic politics towards London. Everything that goes wrong in Scotland, well, that's London's fault. Everything that goes right, well, aren't we bountiful? So, I do think that's one case. And the other is, this is the definition of what civil society is. Before the end of the Cold War, civil society meant everything from amateur dramatic companies to tiddlywinks clubs to any of the things in which people did collectively in the society. And one of the things that resulted from that was quite ordinary people learned how to run a committee meeting, how to keep financial records, because they became secretaries of the tennis club. And that then translated, when necessary, into political activity. But most of the time, political activity was not judged to be necessary. And I think that what happened after the end of the Cold War was somehow there was the definition of civil society became an almost entirely political one, in which what you had are these political pressure groups. And I think that's a bad thing in all kinds of ways, but it certainly took away the importance of political parties, of centralized institutions, and so on. So I do think that an awful lot of what happens in politics takes us by surprise. I don't think those two developments, one was foreseen, the effect of Scottish devolution. I don't believe the other was.
I agree entirely with what you say. I remember when I first went to live in Scotland, which was in 1974, in spite of having a Scottish name and descent. I'd never been there, but everybody amongst my academic colleagues in those days was sort of mildly nationalists, mildly Scot-Nat. But that's, of course, before devolution, before the nationalists were very important. And it was more a kind of cultural thing, I think, then, than a political thing. But of late years, and I retired in 2010 and moved back to England, most of my colleagues who had been, tepid to warm nationalists 30 to 40 years before, they were all saying now, if they all voted to stay in the Union, and they all said, I can't think of a single exception, they all said, if the Scots vote for independence and they get it, well, I'm moving to England. Because the real reason for this was not that they particularly objected to Scottish independence, but it was the kind of people who were going to preside over it. The loudmouths, the activists, the carpers, the whingers. It's a fairly dreadful thought. Incidentally, what John said about how if anything goes wrong in Scotland, it's always the English's fault. If anything goes well in Scotland, that ought to be to England's credit, including providing them with enormous subsidies, without which they couldn't live. So it's a weird thing. There's something quite poisonous about, I think there is something quite poisonous about what Scottish nationalism has become. When it was simply cultural nationalism or cultural patriotism, it was fine. But it has got rather unpleasant.
Thank you. I know there's a question here, or was. Yes.
Yes, another piece of news today, which I think raises the question of how meaningful the term conservative can be. And that is, Britain, as far as I know, has the only government in the world that is run by something called a Conservative Party. It's pretty unique in that. But the news today was that in Cambridge, with a Conservative government, Conservative Home Secretary, the police collaborated with environmental extremists, Extinction Rebellion, to actually close off part of the city. They actually collaborated with them to disrupt the life of the city, and also stood by the other day as the extremists wrecked the grounds of one of the colleges at Cambridge. Now, I can't think of another country in the world where this sort of extraordinary behaviour by the police, particularly in a country that calls itself conservative, would happen. It just seems absolutely extraordinary. Now, in terms of the Conservatives in Britain, my working description of the Tories in Australian political terms is that since Thatcher, they've been somewhat to the left of our Australian Labor Party, and there I'm thinking of things like the Tories' attitude on illegal immigration, on climate change, on the extraordinary legalisation of sky-high levels of overseas aid, of inheritance tax. All of those things are well to the left of Labour in a country like Australia. Now, you've got Boris Johnson, who is a Tory on Brexit, but I struggle to think of many other areas where he's actually a proper Conservative, or his government is. And I'd just be interested, I think Robert Grant, in particular, I'd be interested to hear yours.
I certainly agree with you about that. Boris, I'm at a loss for words when I think about Boris. Though I think few people other than he could have pulled Brexit off. Sorry, can we go back to, before we got on to Boris, that rather threw me. Your general point, oh yes, the Cambridge thing, well, I actually lived there, and what is more, it was my old college lawn that was dug up, and getting a taxi to the station this morning to go to the airport, we had that road Trinity Street is still closed off, so we had to go round. We had to go round the back way to the station.
My basic question is: aside from Brexit, can Boris Johnson's government be described in any meaningful sense as conservative?
Well, I suppose you could say it can't be described as anything else, though it is. The Lib Dem have gone off the map. They've gone off the map now. But no, I think he is in many ways a kind of old-fashioned classical liberal, so far as I know. It's amazing how many people hate him. But then it's amazing the state of hatred to which British politics has been reduced by the Brexit debacle. Not only by it all started with the referendum in 2016, or was it 2015?
16, yeah.
It was 16, yes, 2015 was something else. That started the hatred, and of course the victory, the unexpected victory of the Leavers has even increased it. The fact is, I'm sorry to say, I think the Remainers, though I began as a Remainer, the Remainers behaved extremely badly. It's because, you can see what's behind it, it's middle-class entitlement. And they don't like all these, smelly-socked working-class people who broke the Red Wall down in the north of the country and put Boris in. Well, I say, it's tough. Hard luck.
Let me turn this directly to Ferenc. I mean, in a sense, what Mark's question raises is whether or not it is possible for conservatism to make ground, to establish itself, to change politics in a conservative direction in our current society, because prudence means that we would be challenging forces too strong to overcome. I mean, that I think is for you.
Well, it's a difficult question and no clear answers. But I think that the option is there to do, conservative policies, perhaps not directly, labeling it and packing it up as conservatism. That's a chance, I think. But you remember a few years ago, I wrote a paper on Orban for Danube Institute's homepage, and I think it's still available there, which had the title Conservative or Revolutionary, and it was about Orban. Whether he is a revolutionary, trying to, to turn upside down everything, or is he a conservative returning to some traditions? And I suggested that he is a revolutionary, actually. And it was quite interesting that in Rome, you remember how he described himself? That he tried to become a revolutionary, and somehow he did not get enough feedback internationally. That was his description of his activity, which is quite interesting for me, because when they left power after the first Orban regime in 2002, the Conservative Manifesto was published, and the party, described itself as conservative. So I would be quite interesting, actually, in Richard's view, who is in coalition with the Brits, or were with the Brits, and now there is this rumor that perhaps Orban's Fidesz might go to your EPP party, European Conservative Party.
Do you want to answer that, Richard?
No,
Okay.
I was just going to pick up the earlier point that this gentleman over here made. I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. I know who you are. That is that, Britain, after all, has a very liberal history, without putting a big L on it. And if you're to be conservative in Britain, is to a large extent to be liberal. We don't have anything like the continental kind of conservatism, which was strongly clerical, religious. I mean, you could call Franco a conservative of that kind, sort of proactive conservative who actually wanted to wind the clock back. I don't think any British conservative wants to wind the clock back. I mean, you might get something rather unpleasant if you tried. Yes. And it is, after all, it is a liberal country. I mean, the Lib Dems have gone insane. But before that, there was considerable overlap between liberals and conservatives in Parliament and elsewhere.
Before I pass the hot potato to Richard, which I will now do, just to pick up, Ferenc, what you said, as I remember that in that paper, or in one of the papers we published in the book about Orban's politics, he is quoted as describing his politics as plebeian, which suggests that they were, so to speak, he had some insight into the possibilities of conservatism in the working class, which it seems to me is something which is now self-evident, not just in Britain because of Boris, and not just in this country, but in Australia, in the United States, wherever you're looking, you see the decline of the moderate, what used to be the moderate left, the social democratic parties, and the rise of parties which are, I think, rightly described as populist, but they generally are described as populists. And some of those votes in this country, in Hungary, have gone directly to the main conservative party, I think also in Poland. But that's, well, it does seem that there is now a reordering of politics on different principles happening, on the right particularly, happening throughout Europe, America, and, so to speak, the Anglophone world. But, Richard.
Well, about Fidesz and Law and Justice and Lega and European parties, the only thing I can say is that there won't be any major breathtaking developments in the near future, and that's all I can say. But about conservative politics, whether it's a revolution, first of all, if you take the example of General Franco, right? He was up against a radical ideology. I mean, that was destructive and even murderous, and so it's extremely difficult to judge a politician what you can do in such a situation. I mean, they would have had a Stalinist type of regime, right, in Spain. And I just wouldn't like to find myself in the situation that, as a politician, I would have taken such a decision. But I'm not quick to judge. And here I would disagree with Robert. It's not about winding back the clock. I don't think that we should look at politics from the point of view of inevitability of change. That's what the socialists and the liberals usually do. I mean, they say it's just inevitable. Certain things have to be. I mean, the family, or the marriage cannot be what it used to be. This is not Middle Ages. Things are being modernized. So this man and woman nonsense has to go to the dustbin of history. Now, since we have 200 genders, you have to think of other arrangements. And so if you are up against this sort of ideology, I mean, you have to hang tough. You have to be very determined to defend it, not because you defend the past, but because you defend what is right and good. In the case of a conservative politician, of course, a lot of impulses come from you, from the government. You may feel yourself, and you may be perceived as a revolutionary, but at the same you release people's emotions and habits that have been blocked by the ideology. People are afraid to show their natural or acquired reactions. This pressure, this ideological pressure is enormous. You can see it in the universities in many countries in Europe, in the United States. Elsewhere, and you can see in the corporations, the pressure is enormous. I mean, you wouldn't even you can't even say a wrong word, because you're afraid of being sacked. You have to apologize, and you will never be pardoned. So that's why when I talk about Ferenc's book, I talk about this Dutch experience. In this particular situation, a lot of things were taken for granted. And now we live in a society that nothing is taken for granted. even that marriage is a union of man and woman. I mean, this is not taken for granted. So if you are a conservative politician, you have to be determined to do the right thing.
I think at this point we should call the proceedings, formal proceedings, to a halt. I think that there is still there's some to eat and drink over there, and so I'm going to first of all thank our partners in this, Ferenc, yourself, the author of the book, but also the National Civil Service University for providing the facilities and being our common host. And I'd like to thank all of you, and I'd like to thank our three speakers, all of them telling us giving us marvelous insights into a lot of the political world as well as the world of political philosophy. And so we've really had an intellectual entertainment tonight, as well as the introduction to what is obviously an absolutely must-read book. So thank you very much. May I ask you to thank the speakers, and I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.